Now I will give the word to Dr. Russ Hunter from Northumbria, who is the person who does the lion's share of this project coming to life. He is the curator of it. He is the one who really does the most of it, and who will also take you through this day today. He will be our chairman, our moderator, and will explain all the proceedings and then also introduce his colleagues. So Russ, take it away. Thank you.
I think what Masha is saying is, if it goes wrong, it's my fault. It's great to be back again. It's great to see so many familiar faces. We loved our time here last year. We're delighted to be back again. We have, as Masha intimated, as I understood all that Slovenian, gone international. Well, we've got somebody from Australia, anyway. So we've expanded a little bit from last year. We've moved the boundaries a little bit. So the theme, obviously, of the festival as a whole this year is Nature Gone Wild. And actually, as you'll see from the program, the idea of Nature Gone Wild can take quite a lot of different forms. And actually, the talks we've got today represent the diversity, I think, of what we might mean by Nature Gone Wild. So I'm going to talk in a moment, but I'll come back to that in a second. Alexia Canas is going to talk really about the Australian landscape and how the Australian landscape really becomes a character in Australian cinema, particularly in Australian horror cinema. The strangeness of that landscape for us, the oddity of it, the weirdness of it all, how that kind of somehow takes over and becomes a malevolent force in a lot of Australian cinema. And Steve Jones is going to talk about revenge films, about how we talk about nature gone wrong. Well, it's kind of human nature gone wrong, really. We, as people, if we want to take revenge, we do it in lots of ways. And I think what Steve's going to suggest and what he's going to talk about is the kind of culturally specific way, and look at American cinema and look at revenge in American cinema and see how that plays out. Now, before that, I'm going to talk about quite a different way in which nature can go wrong, and that's through man's interference, through human beings interfering in nature. So I'm going to talk about zombies, and I'm specifically going to talk about Italian zombie films for reasons that we'll get onto in a moment. But essentially what I'm going to talk to you about really is this point at which humanity intervenes in nature through science and things go wrong, where we can't control, we can't predict what's going to happen when we intervene in nature. And a lot of zombie films really are about that. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So without further ado, okay, so tomorrow, I hope you will all come along to watch Zombie Flesh Eaters. This is a still from the film Zombie Flesh Eaters, or Zombie 2, another name it's called by. What I want to do in this presentation is essentially try to explain how the hell we get to a point where we have a zombie wrestling a shark. Because this is one of the key scenes, it's one of the most famous scenes in Zombie Flesh Eaters. And what I want to suggest in my talk to you is that actually the nature of Italian genre cinema as exploitation cinema actually at a certain point leads us to this very, very bizarre image. Before we get to talk about zombies too much, I need to give you a little bit of context about the industry, a little bit of a sense of how we actually get to this moment. So, normally, if you study Italian cinema at all, if any of you have picked up any textbooks on any Bordwell and Thompson, any of those things, what you'll see are people talking about these films. Italy produces, in the post-war period, a lot of internationally famous films, a lot of award-winning films, right? So Italy, the canonical moment in Italian cinema is neorealism for sure. That is the thing that's going to be in every book about Italian cinema. Typically, the kind of films I'm going to talk about today are kind of the sort of under the stairs, not talked about dirty child, really, of Italian cinema. They're kind of hidden away. And it's only relatively recently that within academia particularly, people have started to talk about this kind of cinema and actually suggest that it might be important, that there might be a value to looking at the kind of cinema that we're going to talk about today. So this is the officially sanctioned kind of art house Italian cinema, if you like. I'm going to show you a clip now from a very late period Italian zombie film that should kind of set the tone for what I want to talk about. I won't say anything more now. I'll just show it to you and let you enjoy it.
3 doors of heaven, 3 doors of hell. Those of heaven are within our souls. Those of hell are in the earth. If you are willing to sacrifice your soul, you'll be able to close the opening.
Seems such a nice boy as well. So that's quite typical of what you would expect to see from an Italian zombie film in many ways. It comes right at the end of the cycle of Italian zombie films, really. They start in about 1979 and start to end in the early 1990s. It's gory. It looks a bit cheap in places, in many places. The acting isn't particularly good. The dubbing isn't particularly good. It's not a great example of a film, but it typifies some of the issues that critics have had with Italian zombie films over the years. But it's also why Italian zombie cinema has attracted quite so many fans, because there are those people for whom films like that, clips like that, are particularly appealing. And the kind of cinema we're going to talk about today very much sits within this idea and discourses around cult cinema. And we're going to work out why that is, hopefully. First thing to say is this. Italian genre cinema is a very broad church. It covers a lot of things. So from really the mid-1950s onwards in Italy, you have an explosion of cinema generally. There are a lot of films get made in Italy. But what you get are lots of different genres and subgenres. And whilst we have the officially sanctioned art house stuff that is famous and everybody would encourage you to watch, we also have this stuff which is really popular and shows all over the place, and shows in the US and shows in Germany, and is domestically quite successful. A lot of genre films, ranging from, you know, the film at the top there, Iron Master, all the way through down to sex comedies like The Night Nurse at the bottom there. It's a really broad church of stuff. There's a lot of things that get covered. Now, the key to this, and the key to why zombie cinema becomes so popular, is Italian cinema essentially does have that art house strand, but it also has a highly commercial, highly derivative strand, which you could fit into the label of exploitation cinema. Now, coming into that is the film that we're going to show tomorrow, which is Zombie 2. And this is actually a really good example of Italian genre cinema, I think, and Italian horror cinema. And again, I'll come back to what's interesting about this film later on. But one of the big strands of Italian genre cinema is Italian horror cinema. There are a lot of these films that get produced in quite a short period of time. Now, the author Philippe Met has suggested that actually, you know, genre cinema is the kind of the dark side of Italian cinema. So a film like this, for example, The Erotic Nights of the Living Dead, where somebody thought it was a good idea to combine the very commercially successful genre of porn with the very commercially successful genre of horror, and that if you combine those things, you'd have some kind of super genre, right, that would set you up for life, right? You'd be a millionaire. Except nobody, of course, wants to see zombies having sex with people and all of those things, and it fails miserably, right? But it's a good example of why the reputation of Italian genre cinema is bad, why it has had this kind of dark reputation, really. Because the key to Italian genre cinema is it's trying to piggyback on the success of more popular things and repeat them somehow, with a lot less budget and a lot less time, and usually with less star power, but it's trying to do that somehow. So, one thing that's important to know is this. Now, if anyone's ever watched Il Divo, the film Il Divo, it's based on this guy here, Giulio Andreotti. Andreotti was a strange man who's famous for lots of things in Italian politics, but in terms of what we're interested in here today, in terms of cinema, he changes the law a couple of times and changes the direction of Italian cinema. In 1949 and again in 1951, he introduces a series of tax breaks. It sounds very boring, but what it means is that Italian film has a lot of money pumped into it, and actually there are a lot of guarantees for filmmakers that they'll make their money back. And so because of that, you get this. Now, this is a really tedious table, and I apologize, but it's quite important. So if you look at Italy there, right bang in the middle, the plus signs are for co-productions. Italy, at various points, is making nearly 300 films a year. It's making far more films than the rest of Europe. And the question as to why that is, it's because of this change in the law. Because in simple terms, the Italian state is helping to fund cinema. It's helping to produce cinema. And the law was such that it didn't distinguish between art cinema and genre cinema. It was just about the production of cinema. So you get an explosion of things. Now, to give you some context, take a piece of Italian genre cinema that's very famous, like the spaghetti western. Now, in a 10-year period, there are 450 spaghetti westerns produced. So actually, the bulk of these numbers often are genre cinema, because these are the things that are pumped out quickly in order to try and make money. Now, the period we're interested in today really is the late 70s, moving into the early 90s. And you can see there, Italy is still producing a lot of films. It's still making a lot of cinema, and a lot of that is genre cinema. So that helps to explain to some extent why we have so many films, why often when you go into a shop and you want to buy something that's maybe a piece of Italian genre cinema, there's a dizzying array of choice. There are so many things. Italy is producing a lot. Now, the reason it's producing a lot also, though, these things are always tied into, well, who's watching these things, right? Where are they going? It's important to recognize, first of all, that Italian filmmakers knew that the American market was ripe for the picking at the time. Various things going on in the States that mean, actually, there's a bit of a gap there for cheaply produced cinema that you can export, and the US market was crucial for Italian genre producers. The German market was big as well, and that was also important, but the US market was particularly important, and the domestic market was important too. Now, you can see from these stats that Italy actually has a lot of cinemas. People go to the cinema a lot during this period, 1960s and the 1970s, and therefore, they need content. So again, there's an encouragement to produce. All of these things work together to mean that's why you get nearly 300 or so films a year produced in Italy. Tax breaks, big market abroad, and actually quite a big market at home as well. So, this is a rather famous quote by the Italian filmmaker and critic Luigi Cozzi. Now, Cozzi said, actually in Italy in the 60s and 70s and the early 80s, if you went to a film producer and you said, I've got a fantastic idea, they're not going to say to you, tell me about your film. They're going to say, okay, but what film is it like? So how can I market it? Is there a market already? Will people kind of think they're going to watch Jaws 2? Is that what's going to happen? So in this way, he says, you know, in Italy, we'll make Zombie 2, but not Zombie 1. Now, Zombie Flesh Eaters, which we're going to watch tomorrow night, is the prime example of this. The prime example of this idea of exploitation cinema playing out in Italy. When Dawn of the Dead, Romero's Dawn of the Dead, was released in Italy, it was called Zombie. They changed the name to just Zombie. Now, what Lucio Fulci and his producer decided to do is to say, why don't we make a film and just call it Zombie 2? Who's going to notice, right? And actually, that's what they do. The idea is that an audience will think that that film is connected to Romero's film, has no connection whatsoever, but actually people will think it is. And as long as people come in the cinema and watch it, it doesn't matter if they like it or not, but if they come in on that basis, you've already made money, right? You've already made some money out of it. So zombie flesh eaters is kind of symptomatic of what's going on at this period of time. Genre cinema in Italy is interesting for a lot of reasons. You have a lot of co-productions. So from the stats that we looked at just now, you can see they work a lot with France, they work a lot with Spain, which often means that some of the things might be shot in Spain, they might be shot partly in France, partly in Italy. It varied greatly. We also had international casts. Now, one of the defining characteristics of Italian genre cinema, and actually one of the things that I think is quite appealing, is the performances are often quite strange, because often you have people acting but speaking completely different languages to each other. Because in Italian cinema everything was post-synced in terms of sound, it didn't matter what language you spoke to each other, hypothetically, because you would just add the soundtrack in later, you'd add the dialogue track in later on. So, for instance, on a film like Blood and Black Lace by Mario Bava, it was said that maybe there were 8 or 9 languages spoken on that set. But if you think about that, if you're an actor, if anyone here acts or is involved with actors, being able to perform opposite someone when you don't quite know what they've said and you don't quite know where your cue is, gives you a really weird performance style. An example of this, a parallel to this, is Bela Lugosi. So Bela Lugosi, when he starts in the States and he performs directly in the theatre, he just learns the lines by their sound. He doesn't know what they mean. And so that created this really weird style. Now, eventually he learns English, and it doesn't change all that much, actually, I don't think. But it creates a slightly weird style anyway. So Italian genre cinema was quite famous for this, and this is because of the co-production element. Because if it's a co-production with Spain, you're going to need a certain percentage of actors from Spain. You might have to have a lead from France if it's a Spanish, French, Italian co-production. So it creates quite a strange kind of mix of people, really, in many ways. The other thing to note about them is because you've got these international casts, and because the American market was so important, often what these films are trying to do is they're trying to look like they could be American films. Now, there are certain genres, particularly Italian horror when it begins, where critics and the public believe that an Italian can't make a good horror film, because actually they don't make them for a long time. They didn't make them during that period in the 30s where Universal was churning out horror films in the 40s. So actually when they start, what you find is the use of pseudonyms. You find them trying to get actors who look like they might be American. So let me give you an example. So take these actors here, for instance. 3 of these appear in Zombie Flesh Eaters that we're going to watch tomorrow, right? Richard Johnson at the top there had supposedly once been asked to play James Bond, or so he said. But by the late 1970s, his career was kind of in shambles. He'd gone through a couple of divorces, and he needed the money. And the question people often ask is, why do people appear? Sometimes you find American stars like Mel Ferrer, for example, in Nightmare City. They turn up. People who had big careers before. And people often ask, why are they in these cheap and nasty kind of genre films? Well, there's a lot of reasons, some of them very personal. In the case of Catriona MacColl, for example, on the right here, who's in films like The Beyond, for instance, she said her agent said to her, she was a young actress, do you want to go to Italy for 3 weeks? Nobody's ever going to see these films, doesn't matter if they're any good, won't hurt your career, right? Video's in its infancy, that's not going to work out, right? So you think you can do this and it's not going to come back to you. Obviously, it kind of did, right? But actually in quite positive ways, because someone like Catriona MacColl, for instance, and to a lesser extent Ian McCulloch at the bottom here, they now make their name on the festival circuit. Actually, we're interested in talking to these people, right? Because we want to know what happened on set. We want to know about those films. So actually there's a strange circular thing to this, that initially what seemed like kind of a disposable thing that would go away came back, and then actually now it is quite a positive. Now, Ian McCulloch at the bottom there, for instance, he says that he was cast in Zombie Flesh Eaters. Just he walked in, Fulci looked at him and said, yeah, he's blonde, that'll do, right, you're hired. Because the perception was that made him look American. It made him look like he wasn't from Italy, and then internationally you can sell that thing much better, right? Al Cliver at the bottom there, whose real name I think is Pier Luigi Conti from memory. He doesn't look particularly Italian, but he changed his name to Al Cliver because, again, he thought he would get more work because he would sound American and it would sound much more convincing, because these films ultimately were aimed at the American market. Now, in Italy during the post-war period, Americana is popular. All things American are really popular with young people as well. So actually, there's a dual thing going on, which is you're looking to an American market to sell your films, but also internally there's kind of quite an interest amongst the youth, which makes me sound really old, in everything that comes from America. And actually, if anyone's ever seen An American in Rome, for example, the lead character of that wants to be American, so he does things that he thinks are American. So he puts milk and then puts honey in it and then puts pepper in it, and for some reason he thinks these things are American, and it's disgusting. Of course it is. But there is a really popular interest in all things American, so that helps as well. So you're selling it also to your domestic market on the basis that these people could be American. It's an American film, particularly with directors where you've got pseudonyms. It actually becomes important that you think you're in safe hands because there's an American name that comes up. A lot of the films too, when they had slightly bigger budgets or were slightly more ambitious, would usually film part of the film in the States to give it an authentic feel. So this film, for example, from Lucio Fulci, City of the Living Dead, was filmed partly in Midway, Georgia. Again, because it's not something you can recreate in a studio. You can't film anywhere in Italy to make it look like America, so partly things were shot in America, and all the interiors were usually then shot in Rome. The other thing that you will come across with genre cinema, and this is an example from a zombie film, is a dizzying array of titles, because these things are released in different places at different times, and often the video title or the DVD title will be different from the original title. And you can see from this film here, which I don't know what I should call this film, and this is the other problem when you write about Italian horror cinema or you talk about it, is what do you call these things so that everybody is speaking the same language? Because actually we have all of these different titles, and I've often found myself having conversations with people who are experts in the field and people who are academics or writers in the field, and we're using different titles, and you have to think, now which one is that again? Because this is the nature of this kind of cinema. And the titles, again, are exploitation. They're trying to appeal to a broad market. A classic example of this is this film, Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue. Now, Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue doesn't take place in Manchester or a morgue. The idea was, when this film came out in the mid-70s, the producers thought, it's a Spanish-Italian co-production, the producers thought that England was kind of cool, not sure why, and they were trying to find a city name somewhere in England that would kind of link this film to Great Britain, or to England specifically. So they alighted upon Manchester. And again, it's a classic example of how exploitation stuff works. The idea of getting you in, because it's the mid-70s, and it's sort of, we've kind of had the swinging 60s in London and all that stuff, Cool Britannia and all those things. So actually you might watch it because you kind of might think it might be quite cool. Another example here is, in casting, is casting people who look like other people who are famous. So, for instance, Sean Connery's brother, who appears in Operation Kid Brother, he looks quite a lot like Sean Connery, because he's his brother, right? And the idea is, again, if you see this poster, you're going to think, ooh, it's Sean Connery, that might be quite good. James Bond, popular at this point, right? Same thing at the bottom. James Mitchum, his son looked tremendously like him, right? And so his son gets cast in a couple of spaghetti westerns because, again, you see the Mitchum name, you see the face, you think he might be the same person. There was, it's rumoured, although I've never found evidence for this, an actor who called himself Clint Westwood. Again, in an attempt to try and kind of associate himself with other success. So I mentioned this earlier, the idea of pseudonyms. All sorts of actors and directors in Italian genre cinema had various pseudonyms. You will find at some points they disappear. The early spaghetti westerns, you will see they get used, and then they disappear when that becomes a thing in itself. And actually, it varies quite a lot, because in horror cinema, sometimes quite late, they are still using them. Sometimes they don't. It's a weird thing. But again, it's an attempt to make people sound American or North American at least. The classic example here, I think, is the film director Joe D'Amato. Brace yourself, because I'm about to show you all of his pseudonyms. So, the thing here is this. If you look at those names, some of them are kind of random, but you will notice at various points names like Rafe De Palma, right? Now, my guess is that Rafe De Palma was used at a point when Brian De Palma had a film out that was successful. And so again, it's the brother thing, right? I mean, there are some, my favorite one here is Arizona, Massachusetts, right in the middle there. So if you really want to sound American, just stick two states together, spell them wrong, and you're in good hands. But Italians also imitated each other, right? So they tried to look American, but actually they also tried to imitate each other. In the wake of the success, for example, of zombie flesh eaters, we get an explosion of zombie films. And actually what they're copying then are not Dawn of the Dead, they're copying zombie flesh eaters. The same thing happens in the early 70s. When Dario Argento produces his Animal trilogy, you know, with titles like Bird with the Crystal Plumage, etc., you then get lots of other Italian producers who have Don't Torture a Duckling, and etc., right? So you have all of these Italians trying to copy other Italians' formulas as well. Probably more infamously, though, are films like this. So, has anyone seen Troll 2? There's a documentary about... you have my sympathies. There's a documentary about Troll 2, actually, called Best Worst Movie, which is very interesting if you've never seen it. It's worth checking out. But Troll 2 bears no resemblance to Troll 1. It's not connected. Equally, Alien 2 is not connected to Ridley Scott's Alien. They're completely different films. But it's this attempt to cash in, to suggest you're connected, to suggest, well, if you liked Alien, you're going to like Alien 2, right? That's the idea, at least. That's the thought process behind all of it. I said Italians did this to themselves. A good example is with the spaghetti westerns. So with the Sartana films, for example, we then had all of these films where there are combinations of other spaghetti westerns, as well as Sartana in the title, using the title again to call back to an earlier film, to, in your mind, place the idea that it's similar, that it's connected. But we also have Django here, so Django meets Sartana quite a lot here. We have a lot of variations on this. We also have the spaghetti westerns of Bud Spencer and Terence Hill, for instance, so there are various mentions to Trinity here at the bottom. So you can see how this is a really strange industry, or it appears really strange from a distance at least. It's an industry that in large part is based upon the principles of exploitation cinema. Now, I mentioned that in 1979, Lucio Fulci creates this film, Zombie 2, also known as Zombie Flesh Eaters. And when he does that, it's successful. It works. And we get a lot of copies of these films. Now, what's interesting about this film is actually, okay, so it's trying to copy the title of an earlier film. But actually, this goes back to the roots of the zombie. Because actually what it does is, which Dawn of the Dead doesn't, and the Romero films don't, it goes back to the idea of voodoo. It goes back to the Caribbean. It goes back to the origins of actually where we might think the idea of the zombie actually comes from. So actually, it's closer in some strange ways to films like White Zombie and some of those earlier things that it might be in some ways to films like Romero's. So there is an originality there, actually, so I don't want to suggest there's never originality. And actually, what is most interesting, I think, is when you have films that are copying each other and copying other films, it's actually the little variations that they put in that make them interesting. It's the differences. It's the, how can we make this slightly different? Genre is always about repetition with a slight difference, right? You don't want to see the same film over and over again. So we get that. And I'm going to give you an example now from Zombie Creeping Flesh. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that tonally, these films are quite strange. And one of the things that appeals to people, I think, or I would argue part of the cult appeal of these films, is the strange tonal quality that comes from actors from different countries speaking to each other, yes. Weird dubbing, yes. But also just the script itself sometimes, the idea, the direction, the idea of what you're asking your actors to actually do, the situations you're putting them in. So in this film, Zombie Creeping Flesh, we have a group of soldiers who are in, I think, Papua New Guinea from memory, or New Guinea, sorry. And they are attempting to get to a power plant that's had an accident and actually is the cause of the zombie outbreak that we have. So I'm just going to show you a very brief scene. They, at this point, have with them a journalist who they found along the way.
I don't know who's stupider, those guys with shit all over their faces, or the boy shooting at them.
I think you're afraid of him.
Who is? Me?
Yeah, you. I think you're pissing your pants.
So I'm afraid. Okay. Listen, you just keep the engine going in our getaway car. Just take a sec. Cut it out! Stop wasting your damn bullets, you jerks! You need to hit their heads! I told you! Saying like this! Get away! Beat it! Clear out! Quick, we gotta get away. Hurry! Just a minute! Come on, I said! Well? Hey, what are you waiting for? Come on, let's go! I'm ready for you. What's the matter? You scared? Come on, try it again. Huh? You want to play games? Okay. It's 10 to 1 for you. So let's see where it gets you. Gotta take over. Come on, you stupid future bastards.
Come on, Santoro. What the hell are you doing? Come here, I said.
Shit-faced bastards. You lousy bunch of turds. Brainless monkeys. You can't catch me. Get back to your graves. Beat it. Screw off. Come on. This way. I'm waiting for you.
Damn it. Use your friggin' head. Come on.
Hey, you. What are you staring at? Are you hungry? Ah, I get it. You want a little bite out of me.
You must be nuts. Speaking of those gooks.
Sure, why not? What meat do you like? Drumstick? A wing? Oh, yeah, oh, that's great. A wing, eh? Let's suck this!
Okay, then we get some stock footage at the end. So that again is, you know, it's typical of kind of how odd the films are tonally. I mean, there's a very strange thing that the fact the guy puts himself in harm's way, jumps around, it's kind of odd. The problem watching these things with an English language track is that we don't do dubbing very well because we don't do it very often, and so often you would have the same actors' voices on all of these films. They were never particularly good actors. So say, for example, somewhere like Italy, where you have a tradition of dubbing and they're really good at it, it's a completely different film to watch. But actually, in terms of tone and style, etc. But you can see, you know, there are some odd choices there in terms of the script. There's some weird dialogue, right? It's an odd thing. But again, that's what's appealing. That's why these things have fan bases. That's why people follow these films. They're quirky. They're unusual. They're different. You're not watching these things for some kind of anthropological essay. You're watching them because actually they are quite weird, and you want to see what's the different thing that's going to happen in this. I'm going to show you an example in a moment of actually where these zombie films get quite strange. One of the things that comes, of course, when you have lots of gore and when you have horror films that become into what you might call a more extreme category in terms of the way gore works in them, for instance, is that they sometimes then get caught up in moral panics. Now, in Britain, in particular, in the early 1980s, we had the video nasties. And anyone who was here last year will have heard my colleague Kay Egan talk about the video nasties. For those of you who weren't, you know, briefly, this was really a period where there's a paranoia about what watching horror films is going to do to children. And the videos are not certified, so anybody theoretically could go into a shop and rent zombie flesh eaters or zombie creeping flesh. And the concern in the British press, which is always very censorious, was, you know, what's it doing to the children? What's the impact? What's the effect of these things? So these films were caught up in issues and debates about harm. And that set in place a certain reputation for these films because some of them were on the video nasties list. Zombie Flesh Eaters was prosecuted, for instance. So there's an issue then with these films that they become associated with something dangerous. Now, watching them from a remove, watching them from a distance now of 30-odd years, it's quite different. They don't look particularly dangerous. They seem maybe a little bit absurd even, perhaps. But that sets in place a certain kind of reputation for these films that lingers, I think, for quite a long time. Now, I want to show you a very infamous scene. I hope you've all had your lunches, because I'm afraid it gets worse than what I've already showed you. This is a good example by a director, Andrea Bianchi, who was kind of a run-of-the-mill director, not particularly talented director, but again, who was trying to introduce some variation into the zombie idea. And again, it's partly why I'm interested in these things, is what is that variation, what is that difference, how are you trying to make things different? Here we have some Etruscan zombies, so somebody's excavating beneath a house and they accidentally, as you do, disturb some Etruscan zombies. So I won't say any more, but this has a particularly infamous scene in it.
Now what do we do, Mark?
Let's push this thing over there, in front of the gate. Give me your hand. That's it. Let's go upstairs. Come on, darling.
Here, let me help you.
Let's get back outside, quick!
They're here!
Push it! Push it hard! Go on! Damn you! Go upstairs. Hurry. Oh, it's Michael.
Michael. Michael. Michael. Michael. Oh, my baby. My son. My son. Michael.
Stop, Evelyn. Don't touch it. No, it's a zombie. Don't touch it.
Came back to me. You came back to me, didn't you? Darling, I'm so happy. Oh, Michael. Oh, Michael. Oh, darling. Oh, dearest. Oh, you're here. We'll never leave each other again. Oh, darling. Always together. Michael, look at me, angel. Look at me. Oh, yes, darling. Just like when you were a baby. Go ahead, darling. I know you want to. You used to love it so. Oh. Oh.
I'm not going to say anything. So you can see how these films are pushing boundaries, being kind of playful, doing silly things, being extreme, all sorts of things kind of all at once. And now that does look quite comedic. You may have noticed, for instance, when the zombie was thrown over the stairway, lots of polystyrene came down from the set. It was a very cheap set. It is easy, though, to look at these films and to laugh at them. And actually, that's part of the fun of watching these films. It's part of the attraction for a lot of people, I think, for some people anyway. But you know, they are quite varied. I mean, a film like Nightmare City, and I'm going to show you a brief clip from that in a moment, you know, that has zombies running in it and using weapons. Quite innovative, quite different, quite original. A long time before Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, which everybody said was kind of really innovative because zombies ran and all sorts of things, right? There are zombie comedies. There's I'm a zombie, you're a zombie, she's a zombie, for instance. So there are all sorts of things. It's actually a broader church. It's a broader set of films than we might think. And often we can categorize and dismiss these films as just being copies of each other. But actually that variation is interesting. They're trying to do quite different things. What I want to suggest now, sort of briefly in the last 10 minutes or so, is also other ways in which we can find these films interesting. In any film or any art form where we're trying to say, actually, this thing is worth studying, right? That this thing is worth writing about, particularly within academia, often we will try to defend things on the basis of art or politics. We'll either say there's something artistic in them or there's a message of some kind and it's political. We'll do one of those two things. And actually, if you look at cinema when it starts, one of the things that happens in very early cinema when it's a medium that is new and people are questioning it, as people always do with new mediums, you get a lot of adaptations of classic literary texts. Why does that happen? Partly because they're stories that already exist, but partly as a way of associating it and giving it cultural cachet by saying it could be art. This medium could in some ways be art. So one of the things that we can do with these films actually maybe is to think about them as art or think about them politically. And I'm going to show you a quick clip in a moment to suggest how we might do that. And I wanted to do it in relation to this film, Nightmare City. Now, the film Nightmare City is about a chemical plant that's near a town that has a spillage, and from that you get a group of infected. Now, technically, they're not, before anyone says they're not zombies, they're technically not zombies, but if we want to be technical, then most zombies aren't zombies, so let's not go there. But these are generally accepted as zombies. There's a spillage in this local plant, and a lot of people turn into zombies, and they become bloodthirsty, and what they're trying to do is to cleanse their blood that's happened from this accident by drinking other people's blood. So there's something a little bit different already in that, and slightly interesting in that. The hero of the film is a Mexican actor called Hugo Stiglitz. Doesn't sound particularly Mexican, but he was quite sort of a big-ish actor in Mexico at the time. It's a Mexican, Spanish, Italian co-production, which is the reason he's in the lead. Some very unkind observers have suggested that he's actually already a zombie if you watch him act, because he's not particularly good. But what I want to suggest to you is this. In Italy in the mid-70s, there's an explosion at a chemical plant in a town called Seveso, which is just quite near Milan. Now, 2,000 people are infected with chloroacne poisoning, right? And actually, what I want to suggest is the film tries to pick up on that and tries to reference that in some way. And actually, it has a sort of political message. And actually, a lot of these zombie films, if we take Living Dead at the Manchester morgue, the basic plot of that is that the reason zombies come back to life is because the Ministry of Agriculture has invented a new machine that speeds up the way the crops grow. And actually, again, it's about man, it's about science, it's about interfering with the natural order of things, and that screws everything else up, right? So this film tries to allude to that. Now, I don't want to suggest when you have to try and suggest that zombie films are really profound, or they're making messages in a particularly profound way, but actually quite a lot of them do have this callback to environmentalism. It's the 1970s, early 80s. That kind of discourse of green politics is kind of everywhere. Now, I'm going to show you a clip, and then we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail.
What's the story?
Nobody answers, sir.
You inside, open the door. Come out with your hands in the air. This is Commander Davidson of the Airport Security Police. You are surrounded. In the name of the law, I order you to come out. You have just 30 seconds to make up your mind. Watch, doors open.
It's Professor Hagenbeck.
Now, again, a bit of innovation, something different. As I said, there are fast-moving zombies, they're using weapons. The whole point of this is plot, there's been an infection, right? And actually, what's interesting for me is there's an image at the top left there of one of the zombies from the film. Now, actually, that looks very much like these two images you have here are people who've been infected by chloroacne poisoning, right? And at the bottom, this is a very famous picture of Stefania Seno, who was a victim of the Seveso disaster in Italy in the mid-70s. Like 2,000 people were infected and had some form of chloroacne poisoning. Now, the makeup, I would argue, if you look at the top left, the right, and at the top right here, we have the Ukrainian president, Viktor Yushchenko, who, again, was poisoned and had chloroacne poisoning. Spoiler alert, apparently it was the Russians, but I'm not going to say that for definite at this moment in time. You can see anyway that there's an inspiration, I would argue, in terms of the makeup there. We might just say, okay, fine, it just looks kind of similar. But if you ally that with what goes on in the film, if you ally that with this idea that humans have intervened, there's been an explosion, in attempting to find a non-renewable energy source by using something that's atomic, actually you're kind of playing God, and there's a danger in that because we can't predict what's going to happen. That actually, within that framework, a lot of Italian zombie films start to make a little bit more sense. Now, we can see from the clips we've seen, these are not profound films. The scripts are loose. The dialogue sometimes isn't particularly great. But actually, I would argue in some ways, probably a better way or more effective way to reach a lot more people is to put these kinds of things in popular films. And if you're going to do that, you need to have messages in quite a direct fashion. And usually in these films, there's very didactic dialogue that says, we've done this, this has exploded, man's interfered, this is the reason why we have this outbreak. They're quite explicit about what goes on. So I think in some ways, we can look at these things and we can say, actually, there's politics there, and if we want to, we can dig a little bit deeper. We can find something that's beyond laughing at someone having their breast bitten off, which is that funny? I don't know, but certainly very gory. We can move beyond that, and we can maybe see the fact there's something else going on in these films. Other ways in which we might want to sort of defend these films are to do with aesthetics. Now, I don't have time to say too much. I'm running out of time now, but actually, people have argued that there is something about the way people die in these films that actually is oddly artistic. somebody like Lucio Fulci, who is seen as a bit of a shockmeister, a goremeister in many ways, actually there's something kind of interesting about that aesthetic that a lot of people want to come back to time and again. And if you think about people like Peter Jackson with the film Brain Dead, for example, that idea of gore and splatter is unlikely to have taken off in the same way if those people weren't influenced by and hadn't seen Italian genre cinema in the 1970s, and particularly Italian zombie cinema. The other thing that I just want to talk about very briefly is, well, the final thing I want to say is about cult appeal. Because we can have the politics, and we can, if we want to, try and make an extended argument about art. I will say all these films, even if the scripts are silly and the dialogue is corny, Italian filmmakers were really artisans and actually were really good at what they did. So they usually looked pretty good, actually. They're shot pretty competently. The soundtrack might not be great, the English audio track maybe, but actually they're shot pretty well. But there's a cult appeal to this. So it's partly to do with gore, I think. It's partly to do with difference. It's to do with lots and lots of things, I think. This is a still from Zombie Flesh Eaters, a particularly kind of eye-raising moment that you will see if you watch the film tomorrow. It's a very infamous scene from this film. And it's scenes like this. It's scenes like the breast-eating scene we saw just now. Those are the kind of scenes that have helped this to have a cult reputation, because it's doing something that other cinemas weren't doing or didn't do. And it's doing it often for exploitation purposes. It's doing it to appeal to a particular fan base. But it's doing something quite different. It's attempting to be different. Now, there's a circularity here, which is this, that actually there's a cult appeal that goes beyond just watching the films. Look around the festival circuit. Lots of guests at festivals are people who've directed or starred in Italian genre cinema, right? Why? Because there's an interest in that, because actually we think there's something interesting about those particular films. Now, even the character name Hugo Stiglitz, right, is used in a Tarantino film. And a lot of people have credited Tarantino as being someone who raised the interest in Italian genre cinema again. I think that's a little bit false, because actually what it did do was, for some directors who he said he's liked and he's interested in, the critics have started to notice. But there's always been a fan base. There have always been people interested in these things for all sorts of reasons. And actually, you know, we are here today talking about this stuff. We're showing Zombie Flesh Eaters. We are celebrating Italian cinema in all sorts of ways. So I think it's interesting for a lot of reasons. I think you can look at an industry and say, they produced loads of films, they tried to copy other people, and dismiss it and kind of say, well, that's that, it's derivative. And whenever we use the term derivative, that's a kind of box that we put things in, and then we sort of throw them away and say there's no value there. Actually, what I wanted to suggest is there is a lot to be had in looking at these films and thinking about these films. Lots of different ways we can do that. And in the time we've had here, you know, there's more we could talk about in all sorts of different ways. But hopefully, anyway, I just want to really give you an insight into this weird moment in film history. And I would urge you all to come tomorrow to see Zombie 2 or Zombie Flesh Eaters, just to see, you want to see a zombie wrestler shark. Come on, who doesn't, right? So that's 9:30, I think, tomorrow in the other cinema. Okay, thank you. Anyway, I will leave it there, so thank you all very much. We'll have a very short break now, 5 minutes, just to let you refresh yourselves, and then Alexia Canas is going to speak about Australian cinema. Just to say very quickly, after Alexia's finished, we're going to have a half-hour break where there'll be some food outside. Not that you want to eat after having seen this, I'm sure, but there will be food outside. I didn't think this through very well. So after Alexia finishes, we'll have a bigger break. But we'll just take 5 minutes now, and then we'll start again. So thank you very much.